It was a beautiful summer day in 1997. I was working in my office in the southernmost building on the west side of Manhattan. So with a beautiful view of the Statue of Liberty and Governor's Island, the water, beautiful, beautiful view. And it was a pretty calm day. My job at the time was managing various projects that were not directly tied to security, and I was not responsible for internal security within the organization in which I was working. Anyway, the calm day gets interrupted by a knock at the door from my boss, which is probably how a lot of stories begin, but this one is quite relevant. And she tells me that a virus has gotten onto the corporate network and that the MIS department has no idea how to get rid of it. I went online. I would say that I Googled it, but Google did not exist at the time, so I looked via AltaVista or whatever, and found that only one vendor of antivirus software at the time actually addressed the particular problem that we had. I walked several blocks away to the Egghead software store near the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, bought the copies of the software, bought licenses of the software, brought it back, installed it, and addressed the viruses that had gotten onto the endpoints. Why do I tell you that story? Because it's 23 years later, and the world has changed when it comes to endpoints, right? We've got much more sophisticated management. We've got, it's a world of difference, right? The technologies that we have do not involve walking to a store and buying literal CDs or floppies to install software to fix problems. That said, it's 23 years later, and we're still talking about endpoint security problems. And in fact, as much as our technologies have advanced, so have the attacks, and so have the consequences for the attacks. And while a lot has been said about endpoint security, and I don't need to tell you about it, you all are familiar with the problems and many of the solutions, I did want to talk today about 3 areas of endpoint security that are not getting enough attention. 3 things that, for whatever reason, we don't seem to be focused on, that are definitely contributing to the continuation of the endpoint security problem, and the continuation of the fact that we still need to talk about endpoint security almost a quarter century after that particular incident in my own career. The first issue is the definition of endpoints. And what I mean by that is, 23 years ago, we were talking about some desktops and laptops in the office that were physically connected to networks. We weren't even using wireless networks at the time. And viruses and malware moved around at the speed of dial-up modems. We're talking today about a whole different world. People's endpoints aren't necessarily in the office. They're a diverse set of technology. And in many cases, the devices aren't owned by the organization themselves. But one of the things that seems to happen is that we seem to focus on the endpoints, but not the environments in which they reside. And those are really part of the endpoint equation. And what I mean by that is, in today's world, for example, with COVID and people telecommuting en masse, we're seeing so many organizations that are spending so much time, energy, and money making sure that the devices that the users are using are secure, but are doing absolutely nothing about where those devices are connecting. So if people are connecting from home, for example, what does that network look like? Who else is using that network? Is someone else even using the device? One of the things that I raise, for example, is the router. How many organizations that now have employees working from home have verified that the employees are using a router that is properly configured, that has been patched and updated up to the latest patches or patched regularly, and meets the security standards of the organization? How many organizations have no idea whether the router that is guarding the fort gate to the employee's home, office, or whatever you want to call it, a home working environment, whether that router was bought on a Black Friday 10 years ago for $29 and has not been updated since, and maybe didn't even have its default password changed, but certainly hasn't been updated. Many organizations have no idea. They don't know what kids may be doing on that network. They haven't done anything to isolate the device on a separate network. And there are things that can be done to address this, but in order to address these problems and to improve the security, we have to first recognize that there's an issue. And that issue is we really need to think of the endpoint as not just the device at the end, but also all the layers of that endpoint until we get to an environment where we have some level of trust. And I just give the following example. If someone has a poisoned router that's got DNS, for example, that is routing people to the wrong places, it doesn't matter what security you have on the endpoint. It doesn't matter what security you have in the organization, unless you're doing some sort of full tunneling VPN, and getting all your DNS from the organization, which has other security issues and other legal things that need to be addressed if you're doing that. But you have a situation where somebody could be routed to the wrong machine when they are actually trying to use things properly on a device that is inherently believed to be secure. So we have to, number one, start talking about the endpoint environments a lot more than we have been, especially in the era of COVID, and as this ushers in an era where we will definitely see a lot more telecommuting. The second issue that I think needs to be spoken about is the fact that endpoint security and server security, to a certain extent, have gotten blended, both technologically and legally, and yet many people don't seem to recognize that. And what I mean by that is that there are certain problems out there that cannot be solved at the endpoint or at the server without some coordination between them in many situations. So let's talk about one, for example. Today, most websites, maybe almost all websites, use third-party products within them. So, in the simplest case, if you think of a WordPress website with plugins, right, there's code running that is coming from third parties. On a website, if you set up a website that's got, plugins running, you're running your code, you're running WordPress's code, and you're running code from the plugins. And of course, those plugins may have been written with third-party code from other parties, so you may have fourth-party code running on your site and fifth-party code, etc., going, many, many generations deep. Well, here's the issue. Many attacks today don't involve compromising your server. They involve supply chain attacks. So if a hacker compromises one of the third-party products that you're using, the servers of that party, and either pushes down a poisoned control, right, a poisoned plugin, so you're getting code that you're now distributing that's doing something wrong, or on their servers, if it's the type of situation where there's traffic going back and forth to their servers, does something malicious, your site can be delivering malware, effectively delivering malware to the client, even though your site is secure and the endpoint is secure, because you're really becoming the catalyst and the distribution, almost proxying of the bad code coming from the infected party. Or if it's not bad code, if there's stuff being transmitted to that party and there's a criminal on that third-party server capturing data, you could be delivering a mechanism whereby data is being captured from the endpoint, even though you're secure, the endpoint is secure, and you didn't even deliver malware to the endpoint. It's just that the third party involved in the equation got compromised. Why is that such an important thing to talk about? Well, number one, there have been many, many attacks that use this type of technique, and they have been widely successful because it is very hard to ensure the security of many third and fourth and fifth party products. There are things that can be done on the server to help this. There are things that can be done on the endpoint to help this, and there's things that can be done in a combination to address this issue. But it's something that many times the endpoint people seem to say, well, that's a server issue, right? It's the server sending down the bad code. And the server people say, no, that's an endpoint issue. There's nothing wrong with the server. It's all secure. Something's going wrong at the endpoint, and they're getting malware, but it's not coming from us. This has to be a joint effort and spoken about, and we can't leave this problem by the wayside. And it is a bigger and bigger problem. And here's the kicker. As laws are being written about responsibility for breaches and for data leaks, it's pretty clear that the party operating the website, the party operating that server, and that is ultimately sending code to the client will be held responsible in many jurisdictions for any data leaks, even if they happen because of the third-party code. Because remember, nobody forced you to use the third-party code. So by deciding to use it, you're going to take on some responsibility for it. And of course, any agreements you have with the third party may or may not help protect you, but in the end, regulators may come, and the parties owning the endpoint may come to you, for damages, and of course, there could be reputational damage. So that's another area of endpoint security, because if you think about it, it's really attacking the endpoint. The server was never attacked. This attack is trying to get malware on the endpoint from a third party, or direct the endpoint to send data to a third party that is going to abuse it. The third issue is one of management. When we talk about endpoint security, very often people look at the technology that's running on the endpoint or running to protect the endpoint, but they don't look at the management of it, or certainly not at the same level. And to a certain extent, that's almost silly, because the whole point of managing the endpoint centrally is to manage them. If you didn't need to manage them centrally, you could just give every employee, some money and tell them to go to the equivalent of the Egghead software and install the endpoint security like I did 23 years ago. But we know that doesn't work. And we know that doesn't produce a secure situation. So it doesn't matter if you've got best of breed software on the endpoint if you can't manage it. And part of that management is sometimes endpoint software comes with tools to let you manage it, but in a much simpler way and not using all the features of the software. So, if you've got many different types of employees, C-level people, other folks, etc., and you control the policies and you set the same policies and procedures for everybody, when it comes to endpoints, you're going to end up in some cases where you're going to compromise your business efforts, and in other cases where you're going to compromise security. If you make the rules too lax, it'll compromise security, and if you make them too tight, certain people won't be able to get done things from the endpoint that they need to get done for business. And in fact, many times in the real world, what ends up happening is when endpoint security gets deployed during the planning phase and all the mapping of policies and all that, mapping to the features and decision making, everything is done right with security. But then some high-ranking executive comes along after it's deployed and says, hey, I can't get this done. You need to open this up. You need to change this. And because the management tools don't allow for granular controls, they end up opening up vulnerabilities or opening up capabilities that lead to vulnerabilities for many more people than just that particular executive or what have you. So often it starts more secure and then creates a business issue, and then to address the business issue, security gets relaxed. So this is a real issue. When parties deploy endpoint software, they really need to make sure they can manage it properly. Properly meaning meet all the business and security requirements. If you're not meeting the requirements because the management tool can't do it, even though the endpoint security tool itself has the capability to do it, that's no good. Because if you don't centrally manage the policies and implement them, you're essentially relying on the parties at the endpoint to do so. And again, if you're a technical organization with a few technical employees and that's it, and you trust them to do that, that's great. But for the 99.99% of the world, that's not going to work, and we know it. So we need to start thinking more and more about the management as one of the key elements of it, not as this is a feature of endpoint security, but this is the feature, right? I want to manage the endpoints to keep them secure. I want to manage the endpoints to keep them secure. Not I want to secure the endpoints and then try to figure out how to manage them, because that won't work. Anyway, those are three things I thought would be of interest. You notice I'm not talking from notes. I'm not reading a script or using slides. These are things that are actually in my mind and in my heart as I have conversations with lots of people about endpoint security, and some of the things that I am either hearing or not hearing in many cases that are somewhat alarming. You see attacks happening, you see how they're being done, and people don't want to discuss the issue for whatever reason. And so I think these are three things we should speak a little bit more about. And I think if we do speak about them more, we will see more and more being done to address them. Anyway, thank you and enjoy the rest of the day.